The little black girl ran to the biker inside the airport lobby as a stranger followed her through every gate. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. It was just another ordinary day at the airport. Travelers hustled through the crowded terminals, hurrying to catch their flights, some chatting, others lost in their thoughts. The air was filled with the sounds of rolling suitcases, distant announcements, and the occasional child's laughter. But amid this everyday chaos, there was one moment that would change everything for a little girl and a biker who was just passing through. A little black girl, no older than 8 or 9, burst through the doors of the airport lobby, her face twisted in panic, her eyes wide with terror. She was barefoot, her dress torn at the hem, and her hair was in disarray, as if she had been running for her life. Her small fists clenched the edges of her dress as she ran, her breaths coming in frantic gasps. Without a second thought, she darted across the crowded floor, weaving through people, her eyes desperately scanning the faces around her. She knew she had to find help. And then, in the midst of the crowd, she saw him. A biker, sitting quietly near a row of chairs, his leather jacket gleaming in the light from the overhead fixtures. He was a stranger to her, but in that moment, he was her only hope. Without a word, she ran straight to him. Her tiny body collided with his legs, and she looked up at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. "Please help me," she begged, her voice shaky. "There's a man, he's following me." The biker, startled at first, stood up immediately. His instincts kicked in. He was no stranger to danger, but something about this little girl's fear stirred something deeper within him. He could feel the urgency in her voice. Looking around, he saw a tall, slender man in a dark jacket. Lingering near the entrance of the terminal, his eyes fixed on the girl. He wasn't just a passerby. This man was following her. "Stay close," the biker said, his voice calm but firm. He turned to his friends, who were also seated nearby. The group of bikers, tough-looking with their leather jackets and tattoos, had been minding their business until this moment, but now they understood. Without exchanging a word, they all stood up and formed a protective circle around the girl. The stranger's eyes flickered toward the group of bikers, but he didn't back off. Instead, he took a step forward, moving closer to the girl and the biker who stood protectively in front of her. The biker's hand rested on his jacket, where he kept a concealed weapon. But he wasn't here to fight. He was here to protect. "Who are you, little one?" the biker asked softly, bending down to meet her eye level. The girl, still trembling, looked up at him with tearful eyes and whispered, "He's my stepdad. He wants to take me away. Please, help me." The biker's heart sank. He knew the rules. He knew that getting involved could bring trouble. But this wasn't a choice. This was something that couldn't be ignored. The stranger was too close, and the girl was terrified. "You're safe now," the biker said, his voice gentle but resolute. He motioned to the group, signaling them to surround the girl and block her from the stranger's view. The stranger, seeing the biker's formation, hesitated. He wasn't sure what he was up against, but something in the biker's steady stance told him this was more than he could handle alone. He looked at the girl one last time, his expression hardening, before he slowly backed away. But he wasn't gone. Not yet. The tension in the air was palpable as the girl clung to the biker's side. She had run, hoping for a chance, a glimmer of safety. And now, she had it. But the question remained. What would happen next? The stranger hadn't given up. He was watching them from a distance, waiting for the right moment. And the biker knew that moment would come soon. But for now, the girl was safe. And that was all that mattered. The biker stood firm in the middle of the bustling airport lobby, the little girl clutching his leather vest, as though her life depended on it. Around them, the sound of travelers rushing to their gates filled the air, but to him, the noise felt distant, muffled. His attention was solely on the girl and the man who had followed her in. The stranger, a tall figure with a dark jacket and cold eyes, was still lingering near the entrance, watching them intently. The biker had seen that look before, the kind of look a predator gives its prey. He knew that man wasn't just going to walk away, but for now, He had a small window to protect this girl. His instincts told him to be cautious, but his heart told him to act. "Stay close, kid," the biker said, his voice steady. "We're not going anywhere until you're safe." The girl nodded, her small hand gripping his sleeve tighter. Her breath was shaky, but she seemed to draw comfort from his calm demeanor. The biker turned to his group, signaling them to stay alert. They didn't need to ask questions. They knew what had to be done. They had been in tight spots before, but this felt different. They weren't just defending their turf. They were protecting someone who needed them, and that changed everything. "All right, we've got to move," the biker said, looking back at the girl. "When we move, you stay behind me." "Got it," she nodded, but her eyes were filled with confusion and fear. "What if he comes for me again?" she whispered, barely audible. The biker knelt down to meet her gaze. "He won't," he assured her, his voice firm but gentle. "You're with us now." He stood back up and turned his attention to the man who had been lurking near the entrance. The man hadn't made a move yet, but the biker could tell he was getting impatient. His eyes narrowed as he sized up the situation. The airport was busy, but not so busy that the man couldn't cause a scene if he wanted to. The bikers couldn't let that happen. "We need to get out of here before things get ugly," the biker said to his crew. "Let's move to the exit and stick together." The bikers, each a different type of person with their own stories, were ready. They had all ridden through storms, both literal and metaphorical, and they knew the importance of standing united. No one in their group had to say a word. They understood the gravity of the situation. As the group began to move, the little girl kept close to the biker, her small steps echoing his larger, purposeful strides. They reached the escalator, and the biker's hand hovered near his jacket, ready for anything. The stranger, now more agitated, stepped forward. "I said, let her go," the man called, his voice sharp and demanding. "She belongs with me." The biker stopped in his tracks, turning slowly to face the man. His crew flanked him, each one standing tall and ready. "She doesn't belong to you," the biker replied coldly. "She belongs to herself." The stranger took a step closer, his fists clenched. The tension in the air thickened as the crowd around them began to notice the confrontation. The biker's hand tightened around his jacket, but he remained calm. "If you don't back off, you're going to regret it," the biker warned, his voice low but filled with authority. The stranger hesitated for a moment, scanning the group of bikers. It was clear he was calculating his next move. The biker's eyes never left the stranger's, and the little girl, still holding onto his vest, whispered, "Thank you." The biker glanced down at her, giving her a reassuring nod. "You're safe now," he said, his voice soft but full of conviction. Just then, the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted the tense standoff. A security guard appeared, his eyes darting from the biker to the man who had been following the girl. The stranger, realizing the situation was slipping out of his control, took a deep breath, turned around, and walked toward the exit. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath, but the bikers weren't intimidated. They stood their ground. As the man disappeared into the crowd, the biker let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. "We're good," he said, turning back to his crew. "Let's get out of here." The girl, who had been holding onto the biker's vest the entire time, looked up at him with wide eyes. "Is it really over?" she asked, her voice small. The biker looked down at her, his face softening. "For now, yeah," he said. "But we'll keep an eye out, okay?" The girl nodded, still a bit shaken, but now with a glimmer of hope in her eyes. She wasn't alone anymore. She had a family, even if it was one she'd never expected. The bikers led her out of the airport, their presence a shield of protection around her. They didn't know what the future held, but they knew one thing for certain. They would do whatever it took to keep her safe. The bikers led the little girl through the airport, their collective presence turning heads as they made their way toward the exit. The air was thick with tension, but it was also a strange feeling of relief, like the calm after a storm. The girl, whose name was Maya, walked closely behind the biker who had saved her, her small hand gripping his leather vest. She kept glancing around, as if half expecting the stranger to jump out from behind a corner, but the bikers kept their formation, ensuring no one could get too close. Maya was still shaken, but she was starting to believe she was safe, at least for now. The biker, who had introduced himself as Jack, noticed her nervousness. "You're okay," he said softly, offering her a reassuring smile. "We've got you." You're not alone anymore. She nodded, her small face still tear-streaked, but she seemed to draw comfort from his words. As they stepped outside, the bright sunlight hit their eyes, and the buzz of the airport traffic seemed like a distant hum. Jack motioned for the bikers to spread out, keeping an eye on their surroundings. He needed to get Maya somewhere safe, but they couldn't let their guard down. The stranger wasn't just going to give up. He could feel it in his gut. Let's get to the bikes, Jack said, his voice calm but firm. The group quickly moved toward the parking lot, where their motorcycles were lined up, gleaming under the midday sun. The sounds of their engines revving to life filled the air, a low, powerful rumble that sent a clear message. They were ready. As Jack mounted his bike, he looked over his shoulder at Maya, who was still standing on the sidewalk, watching the scene unfold. Come on, kid, Jack called out gently. Let's get you out of here. Maya hesitated for a moment, but then she walked over, her eyes wide but filled with determination. She climbed onto the back of Jack's bike, clutching onto his waist as they prepared to take off. The rest of the bikers followed suit, their bikes roaring to life as they formed a protective convoy around Maya. The group sped off, leaving the airport behind, their formation tight and disciplined. The wind rushed past them, and the landscape blurred as they sped down the highway. Jack couldn't help but keep an eye on his rearview mirror, watching for any sign of the stranger. The man wasn't going to let them get away that easily. They had to be ready. As they rode through the open roads, Maya slowly relaxed. The rhythmic sound of the bikes, the warmth of the sun on her skin, and the sense of movement seemed to soothe her. For the first time in hours, she allowed herself to breathe. Jack noticed the change in her. Feeling better? He asked, his voice kind but firm. Maya nodded slowly. Yeah, she whispered. I think so. They continued on for what felt like hours, the landscape stretching out before them as they left the city behind. Jack's mind was still focused on the threat that loomed over them, but he knew they had to keep going. They needed to get to a safe place, a place where they could figure out what to do next. Suddenly, Jack's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled over to the side of the road, the rest of the bikers falling into formation behind him. He pulled the phone out and answered quickly. Talk to me, Jack said, his tone clipped. It's bad, the voice on the other end said, a familiar voice. It was Derek, the club's legal advisor. The stepfather's already filed a missing persons report. He's claiming she ran away. Jack's jaw tightened. We need to move faster, he said. Keep him off our tail. We'll meet you in 20 minutes. He hung up the phone and turned to the group. All right, we have to get off the main roads. The stepfather's trying to spin this into something else. We're going to take the back highways. Stay close. The group of bikers nodded in agreement. They knew the drill. They'd been through sticky situations before, but this one felt different. Maya had no idea what was coming next, but the bikers had made a promise to her father, and they weren't going to break it. They took off again, turning onto a smaller road that snaked through the countryside. The trees on either side of the road created a canopy that shielded them from the sun, making the ride feel a bit more secure. As they rode on, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the danger wasn't over. The stepfather wouldn't give up so easily. They had to stay vigilant. They needed to get Maya to a place where they could protect her, where she could feel safe again. But right now, the journey wasn't just about getting away. It was about keeping that promise. The promise he made to her father, the promise to keep her safe no matter the cost. As the convoy of bikers moved further down the winding road, Jack's thoughts remained focused. Maya's life was in his hands now, and he wasn't about to let anyone take that away from her. As the convoy of motorcycles continued down the winding back roads, the sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow across the landscape. The air was cooler now, the wind less harsh, but the tension was palpable. Jack could feel it in his chest. They had put distance between themselves and the airport, but the danger wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Maya, who had been quiet for most of the ride, shifted on the back of Jack's bike. Her small hands still gripped tightly onto his waist, but her breathing had slowed, and her body had relaxed a bit. Jack could tell she was starting to trust them more, starting to believe that she might actually be safe. Still, he knew they couldn't stop for long. They had to keep moving. The stepfather was relentless. We need to keep moving, Jack said to the group over his radio. We've got 20 miles to the safe house. We stop there, regroup, and figure out the next step. The bikers nodded in unison, their engines roaring as they accelerated. Jack kept his focus on the road ahead, scanning the horizon for any sign of danger. The further they went, the more the landscape began to change. The trees started thinning, and open fields stretched out before them. Jack's mind kept replaying the scene at the airport. The look in the stranger's eyes, the cold, calculating look. It wasn't over. The man would come for her. He was sure of it. Jack glanced in his rearview mirror and saw the convoy of bikers riding. Close behind. It was a beautiful sight, the motorcycles lined up like an unstoppable force. But it wasn't just the bikes that made the group strong, it was the bond between them. They had all been through hell and back together. They had seen the worst of the world, and they had learned that loyalty meant everything. Maya had no idea who they were. She didn't know about their pasts, their struggles, or the battles they had fought. But she was about to learn that family was more than just blood. Family was a bond forged in loyalty, trust, and protection. As they neared the safe house, Jack's thoughts returned to Maya's father, Tyrone. Tyrone had saved his life back in Afghanistan, and the last thing he had asked was that Jack protect his daughter. It was a promise Jack had made, and a promise he intended to keep. They pulled up to the safe house just as the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon. The house was an old two-story building, hidden away on a quiet stretch of land. It looked abandoned from the outside, but Jack knew it was secure. They had used it before. The bikers parked their bikes in a circle, blocking the entrance, and dismounted. Jack helped Maya off the bike, her small feet hitting the ground with a soft thud. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. Jack smiled gently, his heart softening. "You're safe here. No one is going to hurt you." Maya nodded, but Jack could see the fear still lingering in her eyes. It would take time for her to trust again. "Come on," Jack said, leading her toward the door. "Let's get you inside." The group entered the house, the door creaking as it opened. The inside was dark and musty, but it had everything they needed. The bikers began setting up security, checking the windows and doors, while Jack led Maya to a small room in the back. He could tell she was exhausted, her small body sagging with the weight of the day. "You can rest here," Jack said softly, pulling back the blanket on the bed. Maya climbed into the bed, curling up under the covers. "Thank you," she whispered again, her voice barely audible. Jack nodded, his heart heavy. "Rest. We'll keep watch." As Jack turned to leave the room, his mind raced with thoughts of the stranger. They had a few hours before the nightfall, and he knew they had to be ready. He couldn't afford to let his guard down. The man would come. He had to. Jack walked down the hallway to where the other bikers were gathered, already discussing their next move. "What's the plan?" Bear, one of the older bikers, asked, his gruff voice carrying across the room. Jack looked at the group, his eyes hardening. "We stay vigilant. We've got a small window to get Maya out of here before the stepfather makes his next move." The room fell silent as the bikers processed his words. They all knew what was at stake. "We need to be ready for anything," Jack continued. "But we won't let anyone take her. Not on my watch." The bikers nodded, their faces set with determination. They were ready. Jack stepped outside to the porch, his thoughts racing. The air had grown cooler, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the sky. It was peaceful, but the calm was deceiving. He knew that the storm was coming. The stranger wouldn't rest until he had Maya. But Jack and his crew wouldn't rest either. They had made a promise, and they would keep it. Jack turned back to the house, his jaw clenched with resolve. No matter what happened next, he wasn't going to let anyone harm Maya. Not now, not ever. The night was quiet, too quiet. The house was still, except for the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards and the faint rustle of wind outside. Jack sat in a chair near the front door, his eyes scanning the dark landscape through the small window. His mind was a million miles away, thinking of every possible scenario. He had promised Maya's father he would protect her, and he wasn't going to fail. The weight of that promise felt heavy on his shoulders, but it wasn't the kind of weight he was unfamiliar with. He had carried burdens before, and he knew how to bear them. The rest of the crew had spread out, taking shifts to keep watch. Bear was in the back of the house, checking the perimeter one last time. Diesel and Clutch were out front, watching the road for any signs of movement. Jack could feel the tension in the air, a low hum of anticipation that seemed to seep into the walls of the house. Maya was asleep in the room down the hall, but Jack knew it wouldn't be long before the stepfather made his move. The man wouldn't just give up. Jack's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a low rumble. His heart skipped a beat as he rose to his feet, walking over to the door. He squinted through the window, his eyes narrowing as he saw headlights in the distance. The bikers had set up a few lookouts around the property, and they were already on alert. Jack quickly reached for his phone, sending a text to the group. "It's him. Get ready." The convoy of bikers was still a few miles away, but the closer the headlights got, the more Jack's instincts told him this was it. The stepfather had found them. The man wasn't alone, either. The low rumble grew louder, and Jack could see the shape of two cars moving toward the house. He held his breath as he watched them approach, knowing this was the moment they had all been waiting for and dreading. "Everyone in position," Jack said quietly, his voice steady. He didn't need to say anything more. The bikers knew what to do. They were ready for this. They had been prepared for the worst. The cars slowed as they neared the property, and Jack could see the outlines of the men inside. One of them was definitely the stepfather. The other was likely an associate. Jack's grip tightened on the phone, ready to call the others if the situation escalated. The vehicle stopped just outside the house, and the doors creaked open. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't move. He had to wait for the right moment. The men stepped out of the cars and started walking toward the house. The stepfather, tall and imposing, led the way, his expression dark and filled with purpose. Jack could feel the anger building inside of him, the need to protect Maya rising. This was it. The moment had come. He couldn't afford to waste any more time. As the men reached the porch, Jack stepped forward, his boots making a soft sound against the floorboards. He opened the door slowly, his eyes locking onto the stepfather. "You're not taking her," Jack said, his voice low and threatening. The stepfather froze, his eyes narrowing as he took in Jack's stance. The rest of the bikers had come out from their hiding spots, surrounding the men like a wall of leather and steel. "This is your last warning," Jack continued, his voice steady but full of authority. "Leave now, and there won't be any problems. But if you try anything—" He didn't finish the sentence. The threat was clear. The stepfather's jaw clenched as he sized up Jack and the bikers around him. "You don't know what you're dealing with," the stepfather growled, his voice filled with venom. Jack didn't flinch. He had been in worse situations before. He knew how to handle people like this. "I think I know exactly what I'm dealing with," Jack replied calmly. "And I'm not afraid of you." The air was thick with tension as the stepfather glared at Jack, the two men standing toe-to-toe. For a moment, no one moved. Then, without warning, the stepfather lunged forward, but Jack was faster. He stepped aside, his hand grabbing the man's arm and twisting it behind his back. The stepfather grunted in pain, but Jack held him firmly. "You don't have the guts to go any further," Jack said quietly, his voice filled with resolve. The stepfather struggled for a moment, then stopped, realizing he was outmatched. He turned his head to the other man with him, who was now backing away, clearly unsure of what to do. Jack's grip tightened on the stepfather's arm. "This is your only warning," Jack repeated. "You leave, and you never come back." The man's breathing was heavy as he looked around at the bikers surrounding him. He knew he was outnumbered. After a tense pause, the stepfather nodded slowly, signaling to his associate to back off. They had lost. The bikers stood their ground, their eyes never leaving the men until they retreated to their cars. As the vehicles drove away, Jack let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The danger was over for now. Maya was safe, but Jack knew the peace wouldn't last. There would be more battles to fight, more dangers to face. But for tonight, they had won. Jack turned to the group of bikers, his face softening. "We did it," he said quietly, a rare smile tugging at his lips. They had kept their promise. And that was all that mattered. The sound of the motorcycles slowly faded into the distance, leaving an eerie calm in its wake. The bikes had made their way down the narrow dirt road, and the group of bikers now stood in the yard of the safe house, keeping a steady watch over the area. The sky was darkening, with only a few stars breaking through the thick clouds overhead. Jack stood at the front of the house, his eyes scanning the perimeter. The last few hours had been a whirlwind, but they couldn't afford to relax just yet. His mind raced with thoughts of the stepfather. Jack knew the man wouldn't give up that easily, but for now, they had won. The bikers had managed to chase him off, but what about tomorrow? What about next week? Jack turned to his crew, his face grim. "We need to be ready," he said, his voice low but filled with authority. "We don't know when he's going to come back, but we need to make sure we're not caught off guard. Let's make sure the house is secure and double-check the exits." The bikers nodded, moving into action. They had all been in situations like this before, where the fight wasn't over even after the first battle was won. The group worked quickly, setting up additional security measures around the house, ensuring every window and door was locked and reinforced. Jack stood back and watched them, his mind still focused on the girl inside. Maya. She had been through more than most kids her age, but there was still that look in her eyes, the look of someone who had been through something no one should ever experience. Jack walked back into the house, his boots making soft thuds on the wooden floor as he entered the room where Maya was resting. She was sitting on the bed, her knees pulled to her chest, her eyes vacant as she stared out the window. She was lost in her thoughts, but Jack could see the exhaustion in her posture. He knew she had to be tired, physically and emotionally drained, but he also knew that she wasn't going to be able to sleep just yet. Jack took a seat beside her on the bed, his presence comforting but firm. "How are you holding up?" he asked quietly, his voice gentle but sincere. Maya looked up at him, her brown eyes filled with a mix of fear and gratitude. "I'm okay," she whispered, her voice trembling. I don't know what's going to happen next." Jack nodded, understanding the uncertainty she must have been feeling. "I get it," he said softly. "But I promise you, we're not going to let anything happen to you. You're safe here." Maya's lip quivered, but she didn't speak. She just nodded, her hand reaching up to wipe a tear that had begun to fall down her cheek. Jack sat in silence for a moment, his eyes never leaving her. He could see the weight she was carrying, even though she tried so hard to be strong. He couldn't imagine what it must have been like for her, being chased, threatened, forced to run from someone who should have been protecting her. Jack clenched his fists, anger building in his chest. He wasn't just fighting for Maya's safety, he was fighting for her peace of mind. The world she knew had been shattered, and it was his job to help put the pieces back together. "Maya," Jack said gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I know it feels scary right now, but we've got this. We're going to keep you safe, and we're going to make sure nothing happens to you. You're not alone in this." She finally looked at him, her expression softening for the first time. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Thank you for helping me." Jack gave her a small smile, his heart aching for her. "You don't have to thank me," he said softly. "I'm just doing what needs to be done. We're family now, Maya, and family takes care of each other." Maya didn't say anything in response, but her eyes welled up with fresh tears. Jack could see the relief in her eyes, just knowing that someone cared. But it wasn't just relief. It was hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, she could start to rebuild her life. Jack stood up slowly, giving Maya a little space. He had to let her process everything, but he couldn't stay idle. He had to stay vigilant, just like the rest of his crew. "I'm going to go check on the others," Jack said, his voice soft but firm. "You try to get some rest. I'll be right outside if you need anything." Maya nodded silently, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Jack walked out of the room, closing the door gently behind him. As he made his way back outside to join the others, his thoughts were still on Maya. She had been through so much, but Jack had a feeling that the hardest part of her journey was still ahead. The bikers were gathered around the fire pit, keeping their distance but staying close. Jack joined them, his face hardening with determination. "We need to keep our guard up," he said, his voice low but steady. "The stepfather will be back. He won't stop until he gets what he wants. But we're not letting him near Maya again. We'll do whatever it takes to make sure she's safe." The group nodded in agreement, their faces set with resolve. They all knew what had to be done. They had made a promise to her father, and they would keep it, no matter what. The night stretched on, cold and silent, with only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees breaking the stillness. Jack stood by the window, his eyes fixed on the darkened landscape. He had always been a man of action, but tonight, he found himself waiting for something that would either change everything or bring everything crashing down. The stepfather was still out there, somewhere, no doubt planning his next move. Jack knew it wasn't over. It couldn't be. Maya was safe, for now, but they had to be ready. He couldn't afford to let his guard down. The bikers had set up a solid perimeter around the house, and the whole crew was alert, each one doing their part to ensure Maya's safety. Jack turned from the window and walked toward the fire pit where the others were gathered, keeping their voices low, but their conversations intense. The night felt thick with anticipation. Bear, the oldest of the crew, was speaking in low tones with Diesel, his rough hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. "We've got to act fast," Jack said as he approached them, his voice cutting through the quiet like a knife. "We don't know when the stepfather will make his next move, but we can't let him get close to Maya again." Bear glanced up at him, his expression grim. "I hear you," he said, nodding slowly. "But we've got to be smart about this. He won't come alone next time. He'll bring backup." Jack's eyes narrowed. He knew Bear was right. The stepfather wasn't the kind of man to back down easily. But this time, Jack was ready. This time, they weren't going to let him win. Jack took a deep breath and turned to the rest of the group. "I'm going to check in on Maya. We need to make sure she's okay. We can't let her feel like a prisoner, even though we're trying to protect her." The bikers nodded, understanding the importance of keeping Maya feeling safe and in control of her situation. Jack walked inside the house, his boots making soft thuds on the wooden floor. As he approached Maya's room, he paused for a moment, taking a steadying breath before knocking lightly on the door. "Maya," he called softly. A moment later, the door creaked open, and Maya peeked out from behind it. She looked tired, her eyes red from crying, but she smiled faintly when she saw Jack. "Hey," she said quietly, stepping aside to let him in. Jack smiled back at her, his expression softening. "How are you holding up?" he asked, his voice gentle. Maya shrugged, her gaze shifting to the floor. "I'm okay," she said, though there was uncertainty in her voice. "I'm just scared. I don't know what to do." Jack stepped forward and sat on the edge of the bed. "I know, Maya. I know it's scary," he said, his voice firm but comforting. "But you don't have to be afraid. You're with us now. We won't let anything happen to you." Maya looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. "But what if he comes back?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jack reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip steady and strong. "If he does, we'll be ready," he promised. "You don't have to worry. We'll take care of it." Maya nodded slowly, her small shoulders relaxing just a little. She didn't say anything more, but Jack could tell she was starting to believe him. He stayed with her for a while longer, just talking about small things, trying to keep her mind off the danger. But Jack knew that the real battle wasn't over. The stepfather would come for her again, and when he did, they had to be prepared. When Jack finally stood up to leave, he gave Maya one last reassuring smile. "Get some rest," he said softly. "We'll keep watch." Maya nodded again, a little more confidently this time. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jack left the room, his mind already shifting back to the plan. The bikers were gathered in the living room, discussing their next move. Jack walked over to them, his face hardening. "We need to make sure we're ready for whatever comes next," he said. "We can't afford to be caught off guard again." Diesel looked up at him, his face serious. "What's the plan?" Jack glanced around at his crew. "We split into two groups," he said. "One will stay with Maya and keep her safe here. The other will go to the town to gather more intel, check the roads, and make sure no one's tailing us." Bear grunted in agreement. "Sounds good," he said. "We'll take the town and keep eyes on the main roads. If he's coming, we'll know." Jack nodded. "We need to be quick and efficient," he said. "No one gets left behind." As the crew prepared to head out, Jack's thoughts returned to Maya. She had been through so much already, and he hated seeing the fear in her eyes. But he knew the fight wasn't just for her safety. It was for her future. He would protect her at all costs. "Let's get to work," Jack said, his voice steady. The bikers nodded and moved out, ready to do whatever it took to keep Maya safe. Jack stayed behind, making sure everything was secure before heading out. He wasn't going to let anyone hurt Maya, not while he was still breathing. The quiet night was broken only by the distant sound of crickets and the occasional rustling of wind through the trees. Jack stood outside the safe house, his eyes scanning the horizon, still feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He knew the fight was far from over, and the stepfather would come back. He had to. The question was when. The bikers had taken their positions, setting up surveillance and ensuring the house was secure, but Jack's mind kept circling back to Maya. She was inside, safe for now, but how long could they keep her hidden? As the night deepened, Jack couldn't shake the feeling of something looming in the air. The calmness of the situation only seemed to heighten his senses. He couldn't relax, couldn't afford to. He heard the sound of boots behind him and turned to see Bear approaching, his large form blocking out the faint light from the house. Any sign of movement? Jack asked, keeping his voice low. Bear shook his head. Nothing yet. The perimeter's tight. No one's getting past us. Jack nodded, though his mind was still racing. He had been in tight spots before, but this felt different. The stepfather wasn't just an ordinary threat. He was relentless, and Jack knew it would take more than just watching the roads to stop him. We can't just wait for him to make a move, Jack said, his voice firm. We need to find out what he's planning. Bear looked at him for a moment, then spoke. What do you suggest? We split up again, Jack said. One group stays here with Maya, and the other goes into town. We gather intel. We need to know if he's making any moves, whether he's looking for her, or if he's already found someone to help him. Bear nodded, understanding the urgency in Jack's voice. We'll do it, he said. But we have to move quickly. The last thing we want is for him to get a jump on us. Jack agreed. Time was of the essence. As the group began to prepare for the next phase, Jack walked back inside the house, his heart heavy with the weight of what needed to be done. He pushed open the door to Maya's room, his footsteps soft on the floor. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, her legs pulled up close to her chest. She had been quiet all night, but Jack could see the fear in her eyes. The same fear he had seen in so many others. The fear of losing everything. How are you holding up? Jack asked gently, taking a seat next to her. Maya glanced up at him, her eyes tired but filled with a glimmer of trust. I'm okay, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I keep thinking about him. My stepdad. What if he finds us again? Jack placed a hand on her shoulder, offering her the comfort he knew she needed. He won't get past us, Jack said firmly. We're not letting him near you again. I promise. Maya nodded, though she still looked unsure. Jack understood. She had been through more than any child should have to endure. The trauma was there, buried just beneath the surface, and it was something she would have to work through in her own time. But for now, Jack could only give her one thing, safety. You're safe here, Maya, Jack said softly, his voice filled with warmth. We'll keep you safe. No one's taking you anywhere. Maya looked at him for a long moment before finally speaking. Thank you, she said, her voice shaking slightly. Jack gave her a reassuring smile. You don't have to thank me, he said. I'm just doing what needs to be done. He stood up and walked toward the door, his thoughts still on the stepfather. Get some rest, Jack said, his voice kind. We've got a long day ahead. As Jack left the room, he could hear the faint sound of Maya settling into the bed behind him. He closed the door quietly, his mind already on the next steps. They couldn't afford to wait. They had to stay ahead of the stepfather, and they had to do it fast. Outside, the bikers were ready to move. Jack walked over to them, his face set with determination. All right, here's the plan, he said, his voice clear and commanding. We'll split into two groups. One will stay here and keep watch. The other will head into town and gather intel. We need to know if he's making any moves, and we need to know now. The bikers nodded, their faces serious as they prepared to head out. We'll move fast, no mistakes, Jack added. We're doing this for Maya. Let's make sure she stays safe. The group of bikers dispersed, ready to do whatever it took to protect Maya. Jack stood for a moment, watching them go, his thoughts on her and the promise he had made. This fight wasn't over. And no matter what it took, he wasn't going to let anyone hurt her again. The tension in the air was thick as the bikers prepared to leave the safe house. Jack stood by the door, watching the team gather their gear, their faces focused, ready for what was coming next. He knew they couldn't afford any mistakes. The stepfather might be trying to lay low, but Jack could feel it. He was out there, waiting, plotting his next move. The house had been quiet since they arrived, but Jack wasn't fooled. The danger was still real. He had promised Maya's father, and now he was promising her that nothing would happen to her. He wasn't about to break that promise. The group split into two teams. One would stay behind and protect Maya, ensuring that the house was secure. The other, including Jack, would head into town to gather information. As the bikers revved their engines, the sound was like a declaration of war. They were ready for anything, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. Maya was safe inside, but the uncertainty of the situation still weighed heavily on him. The team, led by Bear, would watch the perimeter of the property, keeping an eye out for any sign of the stepfather's return. Jack knew that staying on the defensive wasn't enough. They needed to be proactive. They needed to gather intel, find out where the stepfather was hiding, and make sure they had the upper hand. As they sped down the road, Jack's mind raced. The plan was simple. Check the town for any signs of the stepfather, ask questions, and see if anyone had seen him. If they could track him down, they could finish this once and for all. But Jack knew it wouldn't be that easy. The stepfather had already proven he was dangerous, and Jack didn't think he'd stop until he had Maya. The bikers cut through the quiet streets of the small town, the rumble of their engines echoing in the cool night air. Jack looked around, scanning the area for anything out of the ordinary. The town was quiet, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business. If the stepfather was in town, someone would have seen him. They passed the diner, the local gas station, and the hardware store. Jack's instincts told him to check the gas station first. It was open late, and the clerk might have seen something. The group pulled into the station and parked their bikes, the bright lights of the pumps casting long shadows on the ground. Jack walked inside, his boots clanging against the tile floor as he approached the counter. The clerk, a middle-aged man with graying hair, looked up from his newspaper and raised an eyebrow at the group. "What can I do for you?" the man asked, his voice neutral but wary. "We're looking for someone," Jack said, keeping his voice calm but firm. "A man, tall, dark jacket, maybe with a scar. Has he been through here?" The clerk paused, thinking for a moment before nodding. "Yeah, I've seen him. He came through a couple of days ago, got gas and paid in cash. Seemed in a hurry, like he was avoiding someone." Jack's heart skipped a beat. The description matched what Maya had told him. The stepfather was still in town. Did he say where he was going? Jack asked, his voice low. The clerk shook his head. "Nah, didn't stick around to chat. Just filled up and took off. Went down Main Street, I think." Jack nodded, signaling to the group to follow him. "Thanks," he said, his voice clipped. "Keep an eye out. We'll be back if we need anything else." The clerk watched them leave, but Jack didn't take notice. His focus was entirely on the road ahead. They followed the main street, keeping their eyes peeled for any sign of the stepfather. Jack's heart was pounding in his chest as they passed the local bar and the small strip of shops. The street was empty, but Jack had a sinking feeling that the stepfather was nearby, watching them. Suddenly, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He turned to Bear, who was riding beside him. "Something's not right," Jack said, his voice tight. "Keep your eyes open." Bear nodded, his expression hardening. The group slowed as they approached the end of the street, where the road curved into a narrow alley. Jack motioned for them to stop. "This is it," he said. "We'll split up. Diesel, you take the alley on the left. Clutch, check the right side. Bear, stay with me. We'll check the back." They spread out, each biker moving with quiet precision. Jack's senses were on high alert, and every sound seemed amplified in the stillness of the night. The alley was dark, the shadows stretching long across the pavement. Jack felt a chill run down his spine as they walked deeper into the alley. He stopped for a moment, listening. There was a faint sound in the distance. Footsteps. The stepfather? It had to be. Jack motioned for Bear to follow him as they carefully moved forward. The footsteps grew louder, and then Jack saw him. The figure of a man, tall, with a dark jacket. The stepfather. He was standing by a parked car, his back to them. Jack's heart raced as he signaled for Bear to take the left. They would corner him. But just as they moved closer, the man turned, his eyes locking with Jack's. A cold, calculating look flashed across his face, and Jack knew they had been spotted. The stepfather turned and bolted, running toward the far end of the alley. "Move!" Jack shouted, sprinting after him. The chase was on. Jack's heart was pounding in his chest as he sprinted after the stepfather, the sound of his boots hitting the pavement a constant rhythm in the tense air. The man was fast, but Jack was faster. The alley was narrow, the shadows playing tricks on his eyes, but Jack kept his focus on the figure ahead of him. He could see the stepfather's silhouette ahead, weaving in and out of the light. He was almost there. Jack's breath came in quick, sharp bursts as he closed the distance between them. Bear was on his heels, following the plan, keeping pace as they chased the man through the winding alley. Jack could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, his muscles burning from the sprint, but he didn't slow down. They couldn't afford to let this man escape. Not now. The stepfather turned a corner up ahead, his pace quickening as he neared the end of the alley. Jack gritted his teeth and pushed himself harder. He could see it, the moment when they would catch him, the end of this pursuit, the end of the fear that had been haunting Maya. The alley opened up into a deserted street, the soft glow of a street lamp illuminating the space around them. The stepfather turned to face them, his back against a rusted fence, no way out. He was trapped. Jack and Bear slowed their pace, coming to a stop a few feet from him. The man was breathing heavily, his face twisted in anger and desperation. "You think you've won?" the stepfather sneered, his eyes flicking between Jack and Bear. "You'll never keep her safe. She's mine." Jack's jaw tightened, the anger rising in his chest. "You don't have a claim to her," Jack said, his voice cold, his eyes never leaving the stepfather. "She's not yours to take." The stepfather took a step forward, his hand twitching toward his jacket. Jack's hand instinctively moved toward his own, the weight of the weapon hidden beneath his jacket a reminder of the stakes. "You really think I'm just going to let you walk away?" The stepfather spat, his voice rising. "You think I'm afraid of you?" Jack stood his ground, his posture firm. "You should be," he said simply. The stepfather took another step toward them, his eyes flashing with rage. "You're nothing," he growled. "You don't know who I am. I'll make sure you regret this." Jack didn't flinch. He knew the man was all talk, a bully who thought he could control everything. But Jack wasn't afraid. He wasn't about to let this man get to him. "The only thing you're going to regret," Jack said, his voice steady and filled with quiet authority, "is ever thinking you could hurt someone else. Not anymore." The stepfather seemed to hesitate for a moment, but then he lunged forward, his hand pulling something from his jacket. Jack reacted instantly, stepping to the side and grabbing the man's wrist, twisting it until the object fell from his grip, a small, silver knife that clattered to the ground. The stepfather let out a curse, but Jack wasn't done. He shoved the man against the fence, pinning him there with a firm hand on his chest. "This is your last chance," Jack said, his voice low, barely above a whisper. "Walk away, and don't ever come near her again. Do you understand?" The stepfather struggled for a moment, trying to break free, but Jack kept him in place, his grip unyielding. "You don't get to make the rules anymore," Jack added, his voice quiet but full of power. The man's eyes burned with fury, but he finally gave a sharp nod, his shoulders sagging with defeat. "Fine," he spat, his voice thick with contempt. "You'll regret this." With that, Jack let him go, watching as the stepfather straightened himself and slowly backed away, his eyes never leaving Jack. The man turned and disappeared into the night, vanishing into the shadows like the coward he was. Jack stood still for a moment, his body tense, his eyes scanning the dark streets around him. He knew this wasn't over. The stepfather would come back, and they needed to be ready. But for now, Jack allowed himself a small breath of relief. They had won this round. As Bear approached, Jack turned to him, his eyes still focused on the street where the man had disappeared. "He won't be back tonight," Jack said, though he knew this was far from over. Bear nodded in agreement. "But we can't let our guard down. He's not done yet." Jack sighed, rubbing his hand across his face. "I know, but at least Maya's safe for now." Bear clapped him on the shoulder. "You did good, Jack." "We all did." Jack looked up at him, a small, tired smile crossing his face. "Yeah, we did." They walked back toward their bikes, Jack's mind already planning for what came next. He knew the fight wasn't over. But tonight, they had kept their promise. And that was all that mattered. The morning light barely touched the edges of the horizon as Jack sat by the window, staring into the distance. The world outside seemed peaceful, too peaceful considering everything that had transpired in the past 24 hours. He had promised Maya's father that he would protect her, but Jack knew better than anyone that the fight wasn't over. The stepfather had disappeared into the night, but Jack could feel it. He was still out there, waiting, plotting. The next move was unpredictable, and Jack had to be ready for anything. As the rest of the crew continued to monitor the perimeter, Jack felt a deep sense of unease. Maya was safe for now, hidden away in the small room in the back of the house, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the calm before the storm would soon end. Bear approached, his steps heavy against the floor, and stood beside Jack. "We've got to move," Bear said, his voice low but firm. Jack didn't need to ask what Bear meant. They couldn't sit idly by and wait for the stepfather to come to them. They had to take the fight to him. "What's the plan?" Jack asked, his mind already racing with ideas. Bear nodded toward the road ahead. "We need to track him down before he can do any more damage. We know he's still in town. We find him, we end this." Jack took a deep breath, the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. He wasn't sure if they were walking into another trap or if this was the endgame, but they couldn't let the stepfather continue to terrorize Maya. All right, Jack said, standing up and turning to face Bear. Let's gather the team. We'll head into town, hit the usual spots. Gas stations, bars, any place we can gather intel. We find him, we take care of it. Bear nodded. You got it. Jack walked into the main room where the rest of the bikers were gathered. The atmosphere was tense but determined. Everyone knew the mission at hand. Listen up, Jack said, his voice cutting through the low murmurs. We're going into town to find the stepfather. He's still out there, and we can't waste any more time. Split into groups. Bear, Diesel, you two take the north side. Clutch, you're with me. We'll check the south side. If anyone spots him, you call it out. No hesitation. The bikers nodded in unison, their faces set with resolve. There was no room for failure, not when Maya's safety was on the line. The group quickly gathered their gear, revved up their engines, and mounted their bikes. The sound of the engines filled the air as they sped out of the yard, the tires kicking up dust behind them. Jack's mind remained focused as they rode toward town. His thoughts were on Maya. How much longer would she be able to stay hidden? How long before the stepfather made another attempt to find her? Jack could feel the pressure building, but he kept his cool, knowing that staying focused was the only way to protect her. They reached the outskirts of town, where the roads were quieter, and the small businesses seemed to be taking their time waking up for the day. Jack and Clutch rode to the counter, leaning forward slightly. We're looking for a man who came through here recently. Tall, dark jacket, scar on his face. You seen anyone like that? The clerk furrowed his brow, thinking for a moment before he nodded. Yeah, I remember him. Came through a few days ago, filled up, paid in cash. He was real quick, didn't want to chat. Said he was headed toward the motel down the street. Jack exchanged a glance with Clutch, a silent understanding passing between them. The stepfather had been here, and now they knew where he was headed. What motel? Jack asked, his voice sharp. The Sunset Motel, the clerk replied, his hand pointing down the street. Can't miss it. Big neon sign on the corner. Jack gave a quick nod and turned to leave. Thanks, he said over his shoulder, his focus already shifting to the next step. They mounted their bikes and took off, heading down the road toward the Sunset Motel. Jack's heart raced as he thought of Maya back at the house. He needed to make sure they got to the stepfather before he did anything else. The motel was just a few blocks away, and as they approached, Jack slowed his bike, his eyes scanning the area. There it was, the neon sign flickering in the early morning light. The motel was run down, with a few cars parked out front. Jack pulled into the lot, keeping his distance from the entrance. He and Clutch dismounted, walking toward the office. Jack was ready to face whatever came next. They had found the stepfather. Now, it was time to end this. They walked into the small, dingy office, the bell above the door ringing as they entered. The clerk behind the counter looked up, eyes widening when he saw the bikers. Can I help you? He asked nervously. Jack didn't waste time with pleasantries. A man, tall, dark jacket, scar. You check in here. The clerk swallowed hard, his face paling. Why, yeah, he's here. Room 7. But please, he paid cash. I don't want any trouble. Jack didn't respond, just nodded. Stay inside, he ordered. He turned to Clutch, and without another word, they headed down the hallway toward room 7. As they reached the door, Jack could hear the sound of muffled voices coming from inside. He signaled for Clutch to stay behind him, and they quietly positioned themselves by the door. Jack's heart was pounding in his chest as he reached for the handle, knowing the final confrontation was just moments away. The air was thick with tension as Jack stood outside the door to room 7, his hand resting on the cool metal of the door handle. Clutch stood just behind him, watching for any sign of movement from inside the room. The sounds from within were muffled, but Jack's instincts told him that whatever was happening on the other side of that door was about to come to a head. Jack motioned for Clutch to stay alert as he slowly turned the handle, his heart racing in his chest. The door creaked open just enough for Jack to peer inside. The stepfather was sitting at a small table, his back to the door, but there was another figure in the room, a man who looked like he belonged in the shadows, someone who Jack didn't recognize. The stepfather's voice was low, but Jack could hear the edge of desperation in it as he spoke. We can't keep running, the stepfather said, his tone laced with frustration. They're after me. They won't stop until they find me. The other man's voice was even colder. Then we make them regret it, he said. You think this is the end of it? We need to make a plan. Take them out before they get too close. Jack's eyes narrowed as he listened, his grip tightening on the door handle. This was it. The stepfather had allies, and they were planning something worse. Jack couldn't let them go any further. He nodded to Clutch, signaling it was time to move. Together, they kicked the door open with force, rushing into the room. The stepfather and his accomplice jumped to their feet, caught off guard. The stepfather's eyes widened in recognition, and for a split second, Jack could see the flash of panic in them. You! The stepfather hissed, his voice laced with fury. I should have known you'd be here. The man standing beside him, taller and more imposing, immediately reached for his waistband, but Clutch was faster, already closing the distance between them. The stranger tried to pull a gun from his belt, but Clutch's fist slammed into his chest, knocking the wind out of him. He staggered back, dropping the weapon onto the floor. The stepfather, seeing his ally incapacitated, took a step forward, his fists clenched. You won't get away with this, he growled, his voice trembling with rage. You don't know who you're messing with. Jack stepped closer, his voice steady and unwavering. You're not going anywhere. Not after what you've done. The stepfather's eyes flicked toward the window, his gaze calculating as if he were weighing his options. Jack was ready for him. You can run, Jack continued, his voice growing colder, but it's over. You've hurt enough people. It stops now. The stepfather took one more step back, his hand reaching for the door, but Jack was quicker. He lunged forward, grabbing the man by the arm and spinning him around. I told you, Jack said through gritted teeth. This is where it ends. The man struggled in Jack's grip, but Jack's hold was ironclad. He shoved the stepfather against the wall, keeping him pinned. The stepfather's breathing was heavy, his chest rising and falling with the effort. You don't know what you're doing, the stepfather said, his voice now pleading. You think you've won? You have no idea who's behind all of this. Jack's gaze hardened. I don't care who's behind it. This ends with you. He glanced at Clutch, who had the other man on the floor, his knee pressing into the stranger's back. The man struggled, but was no match for Clutch's strength. Jack turned his attention back to the stepfather, who was still glaring at him, defiant but defeated. You're not getting away, Jack said, his voice final. The stepfather's expression faltered for a moment, and Jack saw it. Fear, the fear of knowing he was outmatched. We're done, Jack said firmly, his grip tightening on the stepfather's arm. You're going to answer for everything you've done. The door to the room suddenly slammed open, and Bear stepped inside, his eyes scanning the scene. Everything good? Bear asked, his voice calm but alert. Jack nodded, his grip never leaving the stepfather. Yeah, we've got him. Bear gave a sharp nod, turning his attention to the other man on the floor. We'll make sure he doesn't go anywhere, Bear said, walking over to restrain the man. Jack kept his eyes on the stepfather, watching as the man's defiance crumbled into resignation. You won't get away with this, the stepfather repeated, but Jack didn't flinch. You've already lost, Jack replied. He signaled for the bikers to secure the room. The stepfather wasn't going anywhere now. As they made sure the two men were under control, Jack's mind returned to Maya. He knew she was safe for now, but the battle wasn't over. The stepfather might be in custody, but there was still the lingering question, who else was involved? Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. He turned to Clutch and Bear. We need to find out who's behind this, Jack said. This doesn't stop with him. They nodded in agreement. The fight was far from over, but Jack wasn't about to let anyone hurt Maya again. Not as long as he still had breath in his lungs. The bikers gathered their gear, prepared for whatever came next. Jack looked at them, his resolve hardening. Let's finish this, he said. We're not done yet. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the quiet town. Jack stood outside the motel room, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets, his gaze fixed on the empty road ahead. It had been a long, exhausting day, but they had done what needed to be done. The stepfather and his accomplice were in custody. The threat had been neutralized, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was only just beginning to clear. The bikers had secured the men, and they were now on their way to make sure that the authorities handled the rest. Jack had made sure the stepfather wouldn't hurt anyone again, but deep down, he knew this wasn't just about one man. It was about a pattern, a system, and the people who had been hurt along the way. The promise Jack made to Maya's father still echoed in his mind. Keep her safe. He hadn't forgotten that. not for a second. And now, with the dust settling, he could feel the weight of it lifting, just a little. Maya was safe for now. She was back at the house, her small figure tucked safely under the blankets, finally allowed to rest. It had been hours since they had arrived, and Jack knew she needed time to heal, time to feel protected, to feel like she could finally be a kid again. But there was no time to relax. The town, the people, the web of lies. There were still too many questions left unanswered. And Jack wasn't about to leave until he knew that this was truly over. The sound of approaching bikes broke his thoughts. He looked up to see Bear and Diesel riding back to the motel, the headlights cutting through the dusk. The rest of the bikers followed close behind, pulling into the lot one by one. Bear dismounted his bike and walked toward Jack, his face serious. "We've got them locked up. The cops are on their way," Bear said, his voice gruff but relieved. Jack nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon. "And the rest of the crew?" "They're taking care of the perimeter," Bear replied. "No one's getting in or out without us knowing." Jack felt a small sense of relief. The immediate danger had passed, but now it was time to tie up the loose ends. "Let's move out," Jack said, turning toward the group. "We're not done yet. We need to find out who's really behind this. We can't stop now." The group gathered around, preparing for the next step. They had all come this far together, and Jack knew they were ready for whatever came next. "We'll head back to the house first," Jack continued, his voice firm. "Make sure everything's still secure. Then we'll figure out our next move." The bikers mounted their bikes, the engines roaring to life once again. As they rode back through the town, Jack's thoughts were with Maya. She had been through so much in such a short time, and he wanted nothing more than to see her safe, to see her smile again without fear. But there were still too many unanswered questions, too many pieces of this puzzle left to solve. They pulled into the driveway of the safe house, the headlights illuminating the dark yard. Jack's mind was still racing, but he forced himself to focus on the here and now. They were home for now. The house was still standing, and Maya was still safe. He knew they had won this round, but the fight was far from over. As the bikers dismounted, Jack walked toward the house. The door opened before he could reach it, and Maya stood there, looking up at him with wide eyes. "You're back," she said quietly, her voice soft but full of relief. Jack smiled gently, his heart warming at the sight of her. "Yeah, kid. We're back," he said. "And you're safe. I told you we'd protect you." Maya's face softened, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. Jack stepped inside, glancing around the house to make sure everything was still secure. Bear, Diesel, and the others were already stationed around the perimeter, their eyes sharp and focused. The group had done everything they could to make sure Maya was safe, and now it was time to focus on the next steps. Jack sat down at the table, his mind still working through the events of the past few days. There was no time to waste. He needed answers, and he wasn't going to stop until he got them. "We'll stay here tonight," Jack said to the group. "Keep watch. Tomorrow, we'll start looking into the bigger picture. Who's really behind this, and how far this goes?" The bikers nodded in agreement, understanding the gravity of the situation. Jack turned to Maya, who was sitting on the couch, her eyes now filled with a quiet kind of peace. "You get some rest, kid," Jack said, his voice softening. "We'll handle the rest." Maya nodded, her small body curling up on the couch, a blanket wrapped tightly around her. Jack took one last look at her before he turned away, stepping outside to join the rest of the crew. As the night fell silent again, Jack knew the battle wasn't over. But for the first time, he could see the light at the end of the tunnel. He had kept his promise to Maya's father. He had kept her safe. And no matter what came next, Jack knew he would never stop fighting to keep her that way.